protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at their bar hall. The festival brochure and flyer with details of the full program are available for purchase at the information desk. We are delighted to introduce the gendered contagion. The session is presented by Embassy of the United States of America in India. It is a pleasure to invite Gloria Babena, Minister Counselor for Public Diplomacy, Embassy of United States of America in India, to introduce the session. She joined the US Diplomatic Corps in 1989. A member of the Senior Foreign Service, Ms. Babena assumed her current posting as Minister Counselor for Public Affairs to the US Mission to India in October 2021. She previously served as Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in San Jose, Costa Rica, as Minister Counselor for Public Affairs at the US Embassy in Rome. I request Gloria to please come up on the stage. Gloria Babena.
Thank you for that incredibly warm welcome. It is just absolutely my delight and honor to be here to help launch this incredible session and to support this festival on behalf of the US Embassy in India. I have to say, I have arguably the best job in the world, as it lets me engage with incredible people, incredible authors, and to support amazing causes like this. Health is one of the oldest and most successful areas of cooperation between the United States and India. There is high-level US government support in the United States and in India for this long-standing health partnership. This support is shared broadly across the US private sector, civil society, and the large Indian American diaspora. The United States is committed to this health partnership that benefits both of our countries, the Indo-Pacific and the world. Bilateral cooperation in health dates to well before India's independence. While the United States played a role in the establishment of health institutions across India, Americans learned about yoga and other wellness practices from India. US-India health cooperation expanded significantly after India's independence, with impressive results from eradication of smallpox in 1977 and elimination of polio in 2014, to jointly developing a vaccine protecting against rotavirus, a common disease which is expected to prevent millions of infant deaths worldwide. This history of successful cooperation shaped our joint response to the COVID pandemic, including through dissemination of public health messages and research in developing vaccines. Our public and private institutions are facilitating collaborative research, development, and manufacture of a range of cost-effective vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. The United States and India are working through the Quad partnership and multilaterally to increase the supply and distribution of vaccines regionally and globally. Much more, however, remains to be done. The COVID-19 pandemic is deepening existing inequalities and vulnerabilities in social, political, and economic systems across the world, worsening its impacts. These impacts are exacerbated for women and girls across every sphere with devastating social and economic consequences. Women have not only lost jobs and businesses, but the large percentage of women who work in the informal economy are at greater risk of falling into poverty. While paid employment has decreased, unpaid work has increased for women, as they are usually seen as caregivers for their school-aged children and aging family members. The pandemic has also led to a horrifying increase in violence against women. Many women have been trapped at home with their abusers, struggling to access protection services. There is a growing need to put women's leadership and contributions at the center of COVID-19 resilience and recovery. The United States continues to acknowledge and support the role of women in advancing global health security. In India, this dates to the 19th century, when Indians began studying medicine in the United States. Two young women, Anadebai Joshi and Gorabai Kumarkar, helped blaze this path when they enrolled at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Today, the United States not only supports women's and girls' access to health education and resources, but actively encourages their participation in leadership and decision-making. We will continue to work with government and non-government organizations, education institutions, as well as individuals to reduce the impact of the pandemic on women and girls and help them thrive with dignity, security, and freedom. The U.S. Embassy is proud to present the gendered pandemic at JLF this year as part of our sponsored series entitled Raising Women's Voices in Global Health Security. I look forward to hearing the speakers and to this robust discussion. Thank you again for hosting us all.
Thank you, Gloria, for that great introduction and for setting the stage for our session today. Just to introduce the authors, and the panel, we have Sohaila Abdulali, who belongs to Maharashtra and New York. And her most recent book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Rape, has been published worldwide in 7 languages. Pragya Tiwari works as a policy and culture consultant and is the creative director of Orijo Media and the co-founder of the Indian History Collective. Chinmay Tumbe is a faculty member of the economics area of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and author of India Moving, A History of Migration, and The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World. Amita Nigam Sahaya is a social entrepreneur working in the gender space. She's the director and co-founder of 3 nonprofits and has authored and edited 8 books on women and gender issues. Her latest book is The Shadi Story, Behind the Scenes of the Big Fat Indian Wedding, published by Pan Macmillan. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for our panel today.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be on ground at the famous Jaipur Lit Fest and feel its electric energy and get this chance to interact with our audience face to face. And I hope you have an equally enlightening and interesting time at this session, where we actually are going to be touching on a rather grim subject, which was the silent scourge, which has variously been called the silent pandemic, a part of the COVID-19 pandemic, which touched our lives in so many different ways. Conversations around it were about the economy, the closure of institutes, of a different pattern of life. But beneath that, lurking was a scourge which was rising, as all statistics point out, which, as I just said, was a silent pandemic, but it's not silent. It is filled with fear and anger and anxiety and noises and cries, which get subsumed by the larger subjects, which make conversation more easy. But we need to bring it out of the cupboards. We need to bring out the skeleton amongst us. So in talking about it, we're able to reach some halfway measures to address it. The figures are shocking. Even before the pandemic happened, 243 million women and girls between the ages of 16 to 49 were subjected to some form of sexual and physical violence, more often than not by an intimate partner within the 4 walls, which is supposed to be a haven for anybody. And unfortunately, there is a gendered aspect to it, because 85% of those perpetrators were men. And there were this particular situation which actually engendered it, which increased this violence. You know, there's extended lockdowns, which touched something like a 4 billion population across the world, across 90 countries. It allowed victims to be within the close confines with their perpetrators. And you can imagine how scary that whole situation was, particularly as there was a breakdown of all of the systems that women access to protect themselves. That means, going out of the house, going for work, having family, friends, neighbors to come to your support system as part of your support system. All of that broke down. This is the global situation. But coming to India, the context is even more grim, more shameful. A the rise of violence, as every researcher will tell you, is against particular context, the context of the gender equality situation in a country. In India, where we already are so much at the bottom, at 140 places in 156 countries, the scourge, this violence was even more so on the increase. And unfortunately, because of the internalization of violence, some 53% women actually accepted as part of their lives, as part of their upbringing, as part of what women are supposed to endure. And men, some 43% think it's just fine to perpetrate it. Substance abuse, children also being subjected to this has created an atmosphere of such terrible situations that we really have to talk about this. The Crime Bureau in India, the Commission for Women, the National Commission for Women has talked about the kind of complaints that were received, of which 33% were all about abuses. Today, as we have this extremely distinguished panel with us, we are going to address some of these aspects. Not everything can be covered because this is really a wide subject, but we are going to cover some of these very vital aspects of the silent pandemic, not so silent anymore. My first question is going to be to Sohaila, who has a wide experience on all sorts of violence against women. She's worked on it, she's spoken about it. Her book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Rape, has addressed it in so many various aspects. I'm going to ask you, Sohaila, that you have already talked about violence in all its aspects, its presence, and yet this pandemic led to a huge increase, as all statistics point out. Could you elaborate on this? What is the correlation between the pandemic and increased violence against women?
Well, actually, I had a whole bunch of statistics to trot out, but I've suddenly been overcome by this wave of irritation. So I'm going to talk about that. We keep doing this. Every time there's anything that happens, there's a pandemic, there's a flood, there's a war, there's tsunami, we suddenly come up and say, women have it so much worse. It's so much worse for them. When are we ever going to learn? We have a system, we have a world we set up where we have a stratified system of how we classify humans, and some are the ones who bear the brunt, and some are the ones who get to give the brunt, if there's such a stage. So yes, the violence has led to an increase in, the pandemic has led to an increase in violence against women. It shouldn't be a surprise, and we shouldn't be beating our heads and saying, wow, women have it worse, because unfortunately it's the pattern. But I think one thing that can make maybe my wave of irritation a little less is that this is one situation where all of us, rich, poor, in this world, in that world, wherever, we have all experienced the same thing. We all have some idea of what isolation can be like, and whether it's living in a five-star hotel, whether it's you're a rich person living in your yacht in some ocean, or whether you're living in a basti in Bombay. We all know it. So maybe there's a chance we can kind of relate to the feeling of being locked up with someone. Even someone you love, if you're locked up with 24 hours a day, you all will admit it gets a bit irritating. So if your allowed social outlet for your irritation is to whack that person, you're going to do it. So yes, it has led to a huge increase. I've talked to people in England, I've talked to people in the US. It's terrible. And your usual, like you said, your usual forms of coping have been cut off. You have no chance in this pandemic to be alone, to kind of lick your wounds. And you also have no chance to be with anyone else. You're stuck. I think, though, that because we can all relate, maybe this time we'll start to think about ways in which we can connect better. And I also think that it's important to remember that while things have gotten bad for women, there's all this domestic violence. There have been some amazing coping things that have happened, and we shouldn't lose track of those. There are places in India that have formed bands of women who bang on the wall if someone's abusing them, and then the neighbor somehow manages to go. So it's really important when we talk about this to acknowledge that it's horrifying, but also that this pandemic has led us to think in different ways of how we can connect with each other.
That's a great insight that you've given to us, Sohaila. about the increased presence of violence, certainly, but also the measures that have come up to actually combat it. And I think that is actually a huge tribute to the collective power of human beings and, of course, women. And here, we want to actually take up another aspect of increased violence against women from Chinmay, who has worked extensively on migration and on the pandemics. So there is, of course, a correlation that we already have. I actually want to ask you, Chinmay, that migration, as all statistics point out, leads to, of course, huge anger and anxiety and financial uncertainty and all of those other attributes that people talk about, which give rise to violence and its expression. You have talked about migration. Some 30 million people were actually displaced during the first part of the pandemic in 2020 in particular. So of course, a lot of people lost their working lives and their professions. I would just want to ask you, do you think that the experience of migration was different for women and men? And in what way you think it made women more vulnerable to violence?
Yeah, thanks for this. First point to consider is, what is migration, in a sense that virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant because she moves upon marriage. So on almost any statistic, you'll get something like more than 300 million women in India as migrants. And in a sense, pandemic or no pandemic, they always have these two worlds that women in India are inhabiting. What the pandemic did was actually many things, but it also meant that a lot of women went back home. But even more than that, a lot of the men who typically dominate the so-called work-related migration streams went back home. Now, this had very interesting effects. For example, the male breadwinner in a huge number of families in India was suddenly unemployed for about 6 months in 2020. And in some ways, actually, the woman then became the breadwinner because she was going in the Manrega works, massive uptake in the public works program in rural areas, for instance. So in a strange way, the pandemic also tilted a lot of these relationships within the households in rural India, because a lot of these men, if you look at the Shramik trains, some millions of people who went back in those trains, most of those guys who went in those trains were men. The women who came back, they had it worse because obviously their incomes reduced. Many of them, some studies show, that not come back to the city. So in that sense, if you think of mobility as also being an expression of freedom, pre-pandemic, there were signs that there were a lot of women now moving from villages to cities, which I see as a good thing because they're kind of, exercising their own autonomy. But unfortunately, the pandemic has also led a huge question mark on how hospitable our cities are. And so that's why, if you look at it as a whole, what the pandemic has done to migration and women, the choice of migration itself has come under question. And for me, that is a negative, a huge negative, because for the longest time, women, not for marriage, but for work, were constrained by societal norms and variety of things not to move. And we saw those trends before pandemic that more women are now on the move. But unfortunately, the pandemic has put a huge question mark on that.
You actually came up with a very interesting point, and I'm going to come back to that, once I ask Pragya to talk about an issue which is also very close to our heart, which is, the economic disruption that came about as a result of the pandemic. My question to Pragya is that, in all studies of the increased violence that we've been talking about against women, anxiety, anger, financial uncertainty is a huge catalyst for this very violent expression. We, of course, know that, yes, X number of men were displaced, X number of women had to, lost their jobs. But when you come down to the actual statistics, it turns out that 7 times more women are likely to lose their jobs as compared to men, and 11 times more unlikely to find those jobs again. Graduate and above, women who are graduates and educated also lost their jobs hugely. Men were able to actually find a job. Given this situation where actually the financial uncertainty, of course, is faced by all genders, and yet, it seems that women actually don't have a recourse to it. How would you then explain this expression of a kind of a compressed, condensed violence against women, when both are being subjected to it, Pragya?
Thank you for that question, Amita. So let's just back up a little bit, right? And look at the scale of the problem from a slightly wider lens. Globally, we know that women during the pandemic were more likely to lose the kinds of jobs they held. They were more likely to lose their jobs than men were. In the US, even in March 2020, for example, about 1.4 million people had been unemployed due to the pandemic or, well, correlated with the pandemic, and more women amongst them than men. Now, look at coming to India, this is a peculiar problem because 2004-5 onwards, we have really solid evidence that the gap between education, where men and women are concerned, is narrowing. However, there's been a steady decline of women's participation in the labor force. And in the last 15 years, this has been precipitous. So the pandemic comes in the backdrop of this, right? In this context, we have the pandemic. There is a paper that's a pretty solid paper. I would recommend you read it, even though it came out early in the pandemic in 2020. It was based on the CMIE and CPHS data, which is the consumer the Consumer Pyramid Household Survey. And this was by Ashwini Deshpande. At least she was one of the authors. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact citation, from Ashoka University. And she demonstrates very clearly that when you look at the ratio, women were more likely to lose their jobs in India. Now, you are talking about a situation where women are already not participating in the labor force, and then they're losing their jobs because of the pandemic. Now, this becomes, also there's another caveat to this, which is a rather addition to this, that this was exaggerated, this effect was exaggerated in rural India. Rural women were more likely, even more likely, and Dalit women were even more likely to lose their jobs, all right? Now, we know these are marginalized groups. Now, this is a double-edged sword, right? Why is this a double-edged sword? For one, like Amita was saying earlier, violence is going up. NCW, which is the National Commission for Women, starts telling us even as early as March, April 2020, that there's been a spike in reported domestic violence cases. We know that domestic violence happens when families get together, even if it's for a happy occasion. We cannot discount the fact that sexual violence in particular, at least in India, the majority of it, in fact, over 80% of it is by perpetrators unknown to women and children, and a large number of them come from the family or close family friends. So we have all of the statistics data, like Sohaila was saying. None of this is a surprise, right? We add to this the stress of unemployment. Now, I want to say that that is not a justification for violence. That is simply an explanation perhaps for the violence going up, but there's unemployment among men that becomes a stressor. If you are a habitual abuser, you react badly to stress, and obviously there's escalation. But I was talking about this being a double-edged sword. Now, the other edge of the sword is that let's think about why women underreport. I mean, if NCW is saying that there's a spike in reported cases, that would be not even the tip of the iceberg, because there's such gross underreporting of domestic violence in this country. Why does that happen? There's a lack of resources. We don't have enough helplines. We do not have enough shelters. There's a lack of awareness. Like Amita was saying, there's cultural conditioning. But a big part of it is financial independence. I mean, it's but natural that women think that if they go out and if they report on their husbands or their families, their in-laws, they have no other means to survive. They have to come back and live within this household, and that might actually make things worse for them. This is kind of intuitive, right? Now, you take away the financial independence even more due to the unemployment, right? The same factor that is probably leading to a rise in violence is also leading perhaps to underreporting of violence, because now more women are dependent on the families and men that are probably abusing them. There is another aspect, not just financial aspect, but there is another aspect to going out and working. Proximity goes away. For a large chunk of the day you are away, you have less exposure to your abuser, you know, your the perpetrator. There's another thing. If you look at case studies of women who've been domestically abused, who've been subject to abuse for many, many years, if you look at one thing that's common very often in their stories, particularly at the point when they decide to walk out, when they decide finally to take their lives into their own hand, it is the presence of some sort of a support group. And that support group usually comes from where you work, because friends and family tend to tell you, particularly in a culture like India, to shut up, to suck up and take it, right? Suck it up and take it. So, and that peer group normally comes when you're in Bombay, for example, when you're traveling on the train, you know, you're in the women's compartment, you talk to people, it could be in your office. Now that support group is also taken away. We live in small houses, people can't really talk on the phone freely. So all of these factors compounded make it so much more difficult. And this goes back to the economic question in the end.
Right. That's actually some very important points that you made there, Pragya. Particularly, you know, the importance of economic independence and autonomy in preventing violence. In fact, you know, I remember way back in, I think, you know, in the early 90s, I had read this report about how women in Kerala, those who inherit property because of the matrilineal system there, were insulated from violence vis-a-vis the women who did not inherit property. So there is a direct correlation, and of course, the breakdown of the family support that is so vital to women being able to speak out. Chinmay, I want to ask you about your work on the pandemic, particularly, you know, in your book from 1817 to 1920, you actually have this very interesting subtitle, How It Shaped India and the World. I want to actually bring this mirror to how it shaped gender relations within this long period and eons of the pandemics that the world has gone through.
Yeah, I mean, I can, you know, anchor this point from one famous Indian woman in history, Savitribai Phule, who I'm sure many of you have heard. She died of the plague while tending to victims of the plague, and she'd started this, you know, a nursing center for people affected by plague in the late 19th century. The age of pandemics is a period in global history, 1817 to 1920, where about 70 million people died, of which 40 million were in India. And women were disproportionately affected in a variety of ways throughout this time period. The point I like to make is, you know, if you look at wars versus pandemics, wars have historically killed more men than women. You can be pretty sure of that. Pandemics have typically killed more women than men. And the reason for that comes from two folds. One, a lot of diseases are based within the household, whether it was plague, where the transmission was from the rat to the rat flea to the body, and the more you were likely to be in a house, the more infected you were likely to be. Or with COVID, where the more likely to be in a closed environment, you are more likely to get the disease. So more stay in the house, more chance of getting the disease. The second channel is nutrition. The fact that undernutrition, malnutrition is so much more in women than men throughout at least the last documented 200 years of Indian history, that the age of pandemics devastated women much more. So in the plague, in cholera, much higher mortality among women than men. Unfortunately, we don't know too much because a lot of the history of this period were written by the men. So it's only now that we're getting to know about famous people like Savitribai Phule who were involved in this particular issue. I would just like to end by pointing out, you know, domestic care, right, has historically been, in India in particular, disproportionately done by women. And that's a point of contact where the, you know, pandemic in particular plays havoc. So whether it's nurses, whether it's people at houses, whether it's about who gets the first meal of the house, often the women get the last meal of the house. So your nutrition levels slip. So in many ways, in this historical period as well, we have numerous cases in India in particular about how women suffered much more than men, starting from death, which is the ultimate impact, but also before that, in terms of nutrition, in terms of access to medical facilities, something as simple as that. You know, who gets to go to a hospital is hugely conditional. And I just point by, you know, remarking on a continuity since then. Even today, if you see how we record deaths in India, we do a very poor job in recording the death of women. Because to register a death, you need to go to an office and get a death certificate. And in the second wave, for instance, last year, when, you know, by our estimates, millions of people died in India, we even pre-pandemic and especially, you know, during the pandemic, it's a continuation since the 19th century till now, where we, in fact, do not even acknowledge the death of the woman in the household. So we have very poor information, even from an epidemiological point of view, of what's happening to women in India.
Right. I think that was a very important point that you made, that basically history has been written by men. As a result, women's roles in that has been obliterated to a large extent. We are hopefully correcting this during this particular pandemic. Over to you, Sohaila. I want to ask you that so far we have been talking about, the increased violence against women, but we want to talk about the gendered aspect of it. How did it impact other genders, and also those with alternative sexualities? Do you think there was an increase in violence? Because there's not very many records about that.
Well, it's kind of a double-edged coin, because when it's really important to acknowledge the people who have been left out, especially non-binary, genderqueer, there's a whole invisible population that gets left out. But there's always this really dangerous thing that happens when we get into this discussion, because, for instance, I was once testifying in front of the state house in Massachusetts about a marital rape law. And of course, some male senator stood up and said, well, what about the men who are abused? So what tends to happen often is it's important to talk about the left out people, but what tends to happen is that somehow the other men tend to muscle their way in, and then suddenly it's equal. Like, oh, if you're talking about women and we're leaving other people out, let's talk about men, because after all, they get abused too. So yes, there are many left out, but I think that probably the people who are left out, there are some men who suffer from domestic violence, have met them, but more likely to be left out of people like huge groups of people you don't even consider. And that's when something like violence and pandemic intersects with other issues. Just one example is Islamophobia, which now is huge in the US and in India. And what tends to happen is if you're a Muslim queer person or a femme or anybody who's not, a mythical terrorist, you don't exist. So violence can't possibly happen to you. So yes, other people are affected, but we just have to be careful about the proportions we put on them.
That's quite a phrase, the invisibility of certain groups who suffer from violence, but enough is not talked about it. And that's another worrying aspect, which we hope, from this forum, we will be able to speak about to the larger world. From here, we actually want to talk about another aspect which is impacting us in our day-to-day lives. And every time we open our favorite mobile, that is social media. Pragya, I want to ask you that in the days of the pandemic, we found that the access to social media had increased exponentially. And in direct proportion to that was the violence online, which was directed at women in particular, women journalists, women who were in the forefront in so many other fields were, violently, virulently targeted. I want to understand from you, do you see this correlation between the pandemic and this increased vociferous, vehement, whatever, pursuit of expressing violence against women, rape, you name it, it's all there?
So this is again a global pandemic, part of the shadow pandemic, rather. We have Washington Post on the one hand reporting on the rise of online abuse during the pandemic. We also simultaneously have in India the NCW chairperson holding a press conference saying that they have many more reports. There's been a huge spike in online abuse. Now, the one thing that we, again, taking forward the point that Sohaila was making, we talk about online abuse as a gender neutral term. We often tend to, perhaps willingly or otherwise, disregard the gender nature of online abuse. And you might think, sitting here listening to us, that it's kind of, obviously it's obvious that women bear the brunt of it more than men. But let me just give you the examples of two bills that are in fact being mooted at this point in time: online safety bill in the UK, as well as the European Parliament that's debating a bill as we speak on the sort of oversight of social media companies in terms of the responsibility they have to prevent gender abuse and online abuse. And both these bills, the way in which they frame the problem, they make it sound gender neutral. There is no mention of the gendered nature of the abuse. Now, this is extremely, extremely problematic, of course, but what does that really do to women? One thing that has changed in India is the advent of the internet, the smartphone, people having more digital access, and that could have become a sort of alternative route for women to find resources, to find support in situations like this, or even find financial sort of help in some way or the other. But when women speak out in forums, they make themselves vulnerable to abuse, and that has the effect of self-censorship. And I know I have been through it, and I am by no means, I mean, I'm an upper caste woman, I'm an upper class woman, I'm an independent woman. And I would say my Twitter output has been reduced by 75 to 80% in the last couple of years because I just simply cannot take the abuse anymore.
Right.
So I can't even imagine what it's like for women who don't come from the kind of privilege that I come from.
Right. Can you imagine what a terrible situation that actually one has to do censorship, because of this ongoing abuse. Yeah, I've just been told that we don't have enough time, but one very important question I want to address to Sohaila, which is about the constitutional validity which has been given to immunity against marital rape. Though this subject is being talked about in the courts, but I would like to hear your views considering the coercive sexual practices which apparently are on the increase during the pandemic.
I mean, I think my wave of irritation just turned into a tsunami because it's unbelievable that it's 2022 and we are still debating marital rape. I mean, if at this point we can't understand that signing that piece of paper doesn't mean you become someone's property, then maybe we should just forget about banning marital rape and just ban marriage, because it's just not making sense. But I will say one thing, which is that things are going to get very interesting because now the whole gender picture is changing all over the world. Now, say in America where I live, gay marriage is allowed. So then what happens to marital rape? If a guy shows up and says, my husband raped me, are they going to dismiss him in the same way? So what I'm saying is watch this space, because I feel like things might change.
That's actually a very interesting way of looking at it, that as we open up in different ways, the definitions probably will need to be redefined, rewritten. And that's a very important point there, Sohaila. And from here, I would actually open this session to the audience, and we would love to have your questions, whatever is bubbling under the surface, please express it. And let us know whom you're addressing it to. We have just 5 minutes, apparently. Okay, sorry.
That's it.
Yeah. Please just stand up and just, shoot your question.
Hello. Well, happy to be back in JLF after a gap of 2 years. I'm Saurav, I'm a local resident, and my question is to the entire panel. So I am a certificate criminal justice administrator. And if you know the IPC and CRPC laws of India, as a man, I am sure it would be interesting for the audience and for the entire country to know the kind of limited rights men have in today's time. So don't you think it would be wise to educate in schools and colleges and corporates, where by random printing the important laws of IPC and CRPC of the law body that governs India, to let people know that what is the possibility or what are the precautions one have to take when you ask a woman on a date, because that could turn into so many different
I didn't
things.
get the question. Okay, let's Sohaila say. Okay. Yeah, after that, Pragya.
I'm not really aware of the limited rights of men, so I'd have to be educated on that first. I think that the men who have limited rights, if you talk about any group, within that group, the women always have fewer rights than the men. But where men have limited rights, in my view, is when there's a different disparity. Like you take a rich white woman and a poor black man, and often that man will have limited rights as a comparison. But otherwise, this business of, if you're worrying about being afraid to ask women on a date, then welcome to our world. maybe you can ask some women for advice on how to deal with the fear and terror.
Right, Pragya?
I just wanted to, I mean, again, everything that Sohaila said, but I want to take off from this point and mention another thing very, very quickly. Yes, I mean, I don't believe women have enough rights even under the law. We were just talking about marital rape. But whatever rights they do have, of course, there needs to be awareness amongst women, but there needs to be reform of criminal justice system. As a woman today, again, as a privileged woman, today, knowing my rights, knowing the laws under CRPC, etc., if I wanted to go and file an FIR, I can't even begin to tell you how difficult that process would be. Let's not even talk about the biases and prejudices that are inherent within our judiciary, within the enforcers of the criminal justice system, and what rule of law in this country actually really means. So the laws are dead letter until and unless we bring those reforms about. And that's another discussion for
And
another time.
I just have to add one more thing. And I'm not at all trying to say that men have it good and that there aren't limits to your rights, but in any context, that's not the first thing that comes to mind, because there's usually somebody without a penis who has fewer rights.
Yes, please, the next question. And could somebody take the mic around? We have so little time.
Yeah, greetings to the esteemed.
Somebody, okay, the lady in green, please.
Excuse me, ma'am. Ma'am.
Okay, there are two ladies in green. Go ahead.
Yeah,
If somebody could take the mic around, please.
Can I?
Thank you so much, all of you. It was a wonderful eye-opener. I mean, we keep on hearing about women abuse, rape, and gender, domination and all that. And one thing I wanted to say that there are types of male control. Even in a relationship where you don't have physical abuse, where the man may not slap or do anything, he is still trying insidiously to control the woman by, so often ignoring her, not respecting her, humiliating her. And they seem to be so aware at what time they know how to strike. And we are taking, it looks like, it's a personal thing.
Can we take a set of questions together and then, the panel will address it?
Okay.
Yeah.
So shall I?
very much.
Just
Thank
the
you.
question was that under what this thing it comes to, like you said it's very difficult to file an FIR. So suppose I have or somebody is undergoing such pressure, such intimidation tactics. How do we put it across? I mean, how do we fight against it? And how do we get a concrete result? That was my
Thank you
question.
very much. Thank you for speaking that out. Yes.
Greetings to the esteemed. So my question is to the panel only. Like, as you said, women are still not assertive enough to put their point forward. So as you stated also, your activeness on Twitter has been like decreased. So you are not putting your point forward or putting it to the audience or look at the women who are like looking at you and getting inspired. So how can we do things for the women to be more assertive and put their point forward in the patriarchal society to prove their point or prove their status in the society?
Thank you. And as last question, and then the panel will address
Thank
it.
you so much. Thank you.
Yes, please.
I am A.L. Agarwal, Vice President of Haryana Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Though I am not from legal fraternity, but my point is so many PILs are being filed in India, and sometimes infractuous are there, unnecessary, these are being filed. Is it the same position in USA, or what precisely is the segregation procedure in USA? Because a lot of time of judiciary is taken in PILs, and after that, so many PILs are dismissed and all that. A lot of time is taken by the court for disposing of these PILs.
Okay, that's an important observation. Can our panel then start answering it? Because I don't think
Understand what he said.
he's saying some. Okay, we have these three questions.
May I just interrupt? Thank you for the session, though I entered a little late. I'm Kiran Chadda, a former bureaucrat and now an author and a poet. So my take today on this is that there are some happy things also about weddings, because this institution has lasted for more than 5,000 years. And certainly there must be something good about it. We have only 1% divorce rate in India vis-a-vis what is happening elsewhere. So I think the negativity must not be only limited to
Right.
this one
Thank you.
aspect.
Thank you. So
Thank
let's just, start, request our panel to address these questions. Sohaila, begin.
Which question?
I'll answer what she was saying because it's the Twitter point. The thing is, forever, I'll tell, this is from a very personal perspective. I don't speak for all women, and there are brave women who continue to speak on Twitter despite the abuse. The reason why I took a backseat is because I feel after years and years and years of constant abuse and threats, etc., I feel the onus is no longer just on me to be brave, to be courageous, to put a point of view across. I think the onus has to be shared by policymakers, and it definitely has to be shared by social media companies by doing risk assessment of their algorithms, by doing oversight, and definitely behaving in ways that behove them given the power that they have. So that's my limited point about emotional abuse. I think the domestic laws do cover emotional abuse. The domestic abuse law in India does clearly cover emotional abuse. My husband is a criminal lawyer, so I'll defer to him on this. But as far as I'm not 100% sure, but I'm almost certain that it does cover emotional abuse. So that should give you some recourse.
I'll take two of the questions. One was what you said about what your recourse is. And I think we have to think a bit outside the box and understand that the criminal justice system is not the only system. Because especially now, in the States, we've recently gone through the Black Lives Matter movement, and we've realized that we've been living in this false world where we feel like things are okay. If you're being domestically abused or whatever, you go to the court. But you're buying into a whole other patriarchal system there. The carceral system is really very much skewed against women, against lower caste, against anybody who's not part of them. So yes, we must have recourse, but we have to explore other ways of getting justice, transformative justice, restorative justice, even while we try to reform the courts. And the other thing is the question about weddings. I love weddings. I had a great wedding. I have a fabulous husband. I'm all very happy. What I'm saying is that most marriages give weddings a bad name. I'm sorry to say. It gives marriage a really bad name when you kill your wife or hit your child. So maybe maybe we don't have to ban marriage, but we definitely need to improve the institution, because right now it's kind of sullied. And part of the way we sully it is by not living up to the vows we supposedly make to honor and respect.
I think that about wraps it up. I can see a lot of, signs being flashed at me. Thank you very much. You have been a very, very good audience, and thank you for being here and listening to this extremely important subject. And we would love to hear from you during the lunchtime or whatever, you can shoot your questions, whatever may be on your mind.
Oh, I have to say one thing, which is that Chinmay's book, we're going to sign books later, he has the best first sentence of any book I've read this year. So I highly recommend you buy it.
Thank you, and all the very best.
We would like to thank our speakers, Sohaila Abdulali, Pragya Tiwari, Chinmay Tumbe, Amita Nigam Sahaya, and Embassy of United States of America in India for this impactful session. Our authors, Sohaila Abdulali and Chinmay Tumbe, will be signing their books at the book signing outside the Darbar Hall.